And yeah, we'll start off with a little bit about myself, I guess. I'm an inventor. I've worked a lot in oil and gas and with various electromedical devices, fairly eclectic over the years. And it all kind of started when I was young. You know, I used to take everything apart, and my parents got a new TV set, and a couple days after they got it, and they went out for the afternoon, and when they got home, I had it all taken apart and all over the floor and put it back together. And I had a passion for science, electronics, and chemistry from a young age. I always wanted a chemistry set for my birthday and Christmas and everything like that, but my parents would never get me an chemistry set because they said, "Oh, you'll blow yourself up." And so they ended up getting me an electronics set. So I got into electronics at a young age and started to understand what made these things work. And I was also very interested in a lot of esoteric and different characters throughout history who were sort of marginalized or not very popular. When I was young, I found the Walter Russell and started reading Walter Russell and characters like Victor Schauberger and Nikola Tesla. When I was in elementary school, I remember asking my elementary teacher, into electronics and electricity, and I want to find more about Nikola Tesla, but I couldn't find any references other than in an encyclopedia. He had a small section in this encyclopedia, and my teacher was like, "Oh yeah, never mind about that guy. You should be looking at Thomas Edison. He invented the light bulb. He was one of the most famous inventors." And I don't know what people realize, but back 40 years ago, it was hard to find information about Tesla. Before the internet and all that, I had to search high and low to dig up information about him, and everybody had that same idea. It was like, "Oh, Thomas Edison, he was the famous," especially in North America, right? He was the famous inventor. But it isn't until really recently, when the internet started coming out, more and more people dug up information about people like Tesla, that more information became out. Of course, he's really popular today with the Tesla car and everything like that. Everybody knows his name. But when I was a kid, very, very few people did. So he inspired me to make my own Tesla coils, and I built hundreds of them over the years. And if you count all the Theraphis and the Quantaphis, then yeah, probably into the thousands. It really, realistically, because every one is a Tesla coil and all the Quantaphi coils and that, wound many coils over the years and experimented quite a bit with it. And another character that I came across at a young age, I guess around just after I got out of high school, this book came out, The Cancer Cure That Worked by Barry Loynes. And it was about the Royal Raymond Rife. And that's really when I took a deep dive. Is everybody familiar with Royal Rife? Yeah? Some people? Yeah, Rife was a medical doctor. Well, not officially a medical doctor, but he got an honorary doctorate degree. He was an engineer, and he was a mechanical engineer, and he designed amazing pieces of machinery. He built speedboats with 12-cylinder engines, and this is one of his most famous universal microscopes. The universal microscope had like 1,200 moving pieces in it, and he engineered and machined and built the whole thing. And what he claimed he could do was see beyond the theoretical minimum of the wavelengths of light, which is interesting because nowadays we use an electron scanning microscope to see anything very small. You can't do it with living things. An electron scanning microscope has to, it sends a beam of ions that basically will kill anything that's on the slide. So even till this day, we cannot see living things live inside of things. We see them with the electron scanning microscope, and they're dead. But what he was claiming is that he could see them at this small level. And things he was looking at was viruses. And we can do that today, but not seeing a living virus. And what he did was he isolated certain viruses that he said were the cause of cancer. And he was able to observe them, isolate them, filter them, and put them into another solution that he could inject into another lab animal, like a lab rat, and cause cancer in the lab rat. And then he would grow these tumors in the lab rat and slice them out and operate on them, and then treat them with this machine that he devised, which became known as the Rife machine. And so he said, basically he understood the fundamentals of what caused cancer and how to treat it. So a board of doctors all got together and said, all right, we'll give you 13 terminally ill cancer patients, and if you have success with them, then we'll look further into your work. And he ended up treating and curing most of them, and he became quite famous in his day. And then it was shortly after that the American Medical Association was starting to be formed, and for whatever reasons they sidelined his work, probably because in the cancer, it was a big money industry, and the medical institutions and pharmaceutical companies that were coming on board at that time, were threatened somewhat by his device. And also at that time, and I collect a lot of old medical books, and there was all kinds of electromedical therapies. Nowadays, we use electromedical devices mostly for diagnostics. So we have EKG, EEG machines, MRIs, and all kinds of things to diagnose, but nothing to treat. So all these electronic instruments, and there was quite a few of them at that time, and some of my other talks I go into details about all the different people that had different electronic devices for treating disease, just kind of got sidelined and railroaded and written out of the pages of history. And essentially that's what happened to Royal Rife. When I read that book that Barry published, nobody knew about Rife. And we started a Rife group up in Canada, and we meet every year. And every year more and more stuff was coming out of the woodwork. People were finding recordings, audio recordings of Rife, all kinds of papers, and he documented everything. He was friends with Carl Zeiss, and he designed the lenses in his microscope. So he was a really good scientist, and he documented and recorded all his stuff. And all this stuff just got buried and washed away after they kind of destroyed his laboratory, and he ended up going to jail in the end and died a poor broken man. But all this stuff got buried, and it was probably around the late 80s, early 90s that all this stuff started coming to the surface. And it was a really neat time for this. So I kind of went down that rabbit hole of finding everything that I could find about Rife, how he built these machines, what he was doing. And he was basically using RF amplifiers to power these tubes, a plasma tube like you see here. And he'd fill these tubes with noble gas, and he used the tube like an antenna to excite the gases inside of the tube with radio frequencies. And these radio frequencies emitted this electrostatic field that was emanating from these antennas, and that's what he was using to kill the viruses with. So a lot of Rife's original machines, he discovered certain frequencies were good for certain diseases. So he matched up, and in the beginning he only had like 12 frequencies, and they were, would do things like even things like botulism and stuff like that he could target with these frequencies. And over the years, after his machines, he got a few of them out to medical doctors, and that the powers that shouldn't be basically followed those people around that had those machines and knocked on their door and said, give up your machine or we'll take away your medical license to practice. And so many of them did, and even the machines kind of disappeared off the radar. Some of them came back over the years. Some were found in various places, and hidden in different people's attics and stuff like that. And we've been able to recreate that. In the beginning, we were taking RF amplifiers for ham radios and CB radios, basically. And I would take the CB radios apart and pull out all the harmonic suppression, because what you want with these type of devices is a wide band of frequencies that you could expand your carrier wave to a wide band, and you targeted your carrier wave to target these frequencies, and you created a very powerful wave from the electrostatic field and the photonic emissions that came from the tube that could target various different diseases and things like that. And over the years, people started compiling more and more things. Like, probably a lot of you are familiar with the Hilda Clark zapper, like these frequency-based zappers. So a lot of people call these zapper things Rife machines. In the early days, a lot of people had these electrode-based ones, and that was John Crane, who worked with Royal Rife, who popularized those ways of pulsing the current through the things. Because in order to, especially back then, to make RF amplifiers that were capable of having enough power and being as accurate enough to excite plasma was very hard to do. So for many years, these zapper type devices came on the market, and I built several of the little zappers that people could strap on, and I'd put silver coins, weld the electrodes of silver coins, and you could wear these around all day. So people started just gathering empirical evidence to saying, oh, you know, I use this frequency and it worked for this, or fevers, or colds, whatnot. And the list grew, and it became quite a huge list of frequencies for these things. And I call these type of devices destructive devices, because what they're doing is they're targeting the resonance of these specific pathogens and disease conditions, and actually destroying it. And one of the early people in those days, James Baer, who came up with a system that used the RF amplifiers and the CB radio that I started out with, would show he'd take like a plepharisma or some little microorganism, put it on a slide, and you hit the resonant frequency of that organism, and you'd see the cell wall of it shatter and blow up right on the slide, and all the cell contents spill out before you. So that's when I knew there was something to it, and I was like, okay, well, we'll start making some of these machines and putting them out there. And I had a lot of different people buy them and use them in clinics, and had quite a bit of success. But anytime I interface with any kind of academic people or anything like that, where they were just like, you're crazy, you know, the body has nothing to do with electricity and electromagnetic waves and nothing like that. And there's, you know, this is just pseudoscience. And I actually, you know, kind of gave up on it, because I thought, well, there's no future in building these things, even though they worked and some people were getting help from them. There was just such a pushback from being able to try to really quantify anything to say, all right, somebody could write an academic paper on these frequencies and things like that. Nobody had any interest back then. Tides have turned, though, in the last few years, that's for sure. Even in the beginning, when I made the first Theraphi, and we put, you know, made the announcement and put it out there, in the beginning I thought, well, you know, I've tried this years ago, and nobody's really interested in these kind of things. But little did I know that the world had caught up, and there was a huge interest in it. And so people started using these machines and getting really good success. And even in academia, there was all kinds of new things coming out about frequencies and resonance and that. So really, when it comes down to the fundamental principles of nature, it's all about charge. It's all about electricity. We live in an electric universe. All the, you know, if you're an atomist, everything that's holding these tables together and all the atomic structures and everything is all held together by charge. So every atom has electrons spinning around the outside, and they have bonds, and they have strong bonds and weak bonds, and things like water and air and stuff like that. So it's all about charge. And if you get down to the fundamentals in physics, biology or chemistry, you really realize that it really comes down to electricity. Electricity is what holds all this together. And all matter is really just, all the elements in the periodic tables are just harmonic resonances of certain vibrations. And as those vibrations increase, they gather together more what we call protons and neutrons into the nucleus of atoms, and they have these higher resonant patterns. And going back to Walter Russell, this is what Walter Russell was saying all along. So after reading books like his, and the Universal One was the big one for me that kind of put it all together, and he drew the periodic table in these spirals, and everything kind of lined up in harmonic resonances, because all the elements on the periodic table, the way we draw them out today, are just based on the atomic number or the amount of protons in the nucleus as they get heavier. But he had the harmonics and how everything was hinged on carbon, and the periodic table folded in this double spiral thing, which just more conform with nature. And the same with Victor Schauberger. When I started finding out about Victor Schauberger and read a lot of his works, he would just said, nature is my teacher. I'm just emulating nature. And because I had sort of an esoteric background in sort of occult type things and esoteric philosophy, I understood that the principles, what the alchemists were talking about, the philosophical principles, because that's what they said, everything is as it is above, so it is below, as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes would say. Then it's all part of this big fractal that repeats these patterns over and over again. And years later, when I met Dan Winter, and he's always said everything's fractal and recursive, it all made sense. So it kind of all came together. And the original Theraphi device was based on plasma. So what I wanted to create with when we created the Theraphi was initially something big enough to have a plasma tube that you could put an entire person inside. So I visualized this MRI machine where it'd be like a giant glass bubble, and you'd have a table that could slide into this plasma tube and fully expose the whole body to the plasma. Yeah, exactly. But that's obviously what wasn't very possible. So I came up with this idea of, well, why not split the cathode and the electrode? In electronics, you have a positive and a negative, so everything has a polarity. Why not split those polarities, and then you could put something in between? So if this was positive, that one's negative, and you could have your subject in between. So that's how the Theraphi kind of came about. I took all those old technologies, including the pulsed electromagnetic fields, the light devices, and all the different things that I'd made over the years, combined them all into one to create the Theraphi. And so a lot of people asked, once the Theraphi got popular, is like, well, can you make a smaller version, a home version? And that's where the Quantaphi came about. So this was something that it's a little more portable, and you could have it in your home without having a dedicated space for it. And the main idea was to open it up to have more frequencies available that you could put into it. So you could use Rife type frequencies in the Quantaphi. And a lot of people wanted to, use the list that everybody came up with over the years, with all the Rife frequencies that people had gathered over the years. They called them Rife frequencies, even though Rife only had a few original ones. They just kind of evolved to be called Rife frequencies. So that's when I created the Quantaphi, and I thought, well, why not combine, because the Quantaphi uses, and the Theraphi uses RF to excite plasma, and if you really want to run lower frequencies, you'd get into the sound range. So anywhere from 20 hertz up to 44 kilohertz is your average stereo runs at a bandwidth of that, and that's what we listen to audio music with. Why not combine the sound and the light all together? So this, with the Quantaphi, it's possible to have speakers, and you could play anything you want into into the plasma, basically. So you could listen to the sound as well as get the RF magnetic fields from the coils and the photonic emissions from the plasma that's being excited, and create this electrostatic field. And that's the most important thing about these particular devices, is that they condition the space. So because it's like a radio transmitter, it's actually transmitting the frequencies and the waves into the area around you. And the field is the most important part. And when you split your negative and your positive off into separate cathodes or into separate electrodes and space them apart, then you're almost creating like a dipole antenna. So you can transmit these frequencies more effectively. And the fields are quite strong around the Theraphi. We try to concentrate it into an area where you're on a bed and you have one tube at your head and one tube at your foot. And with the Quantaphi, it's possible to actually fill the whole room. So you could put one coil in this corner of the room and one coil in that corner of the room, and then it creates like a vesica, sort of Pisces field, where the vesica in the center is the sweet spot. What I like to call the counter space, this part in between. When you lay in between the fields, your danchin is basically in that point of counter space. And what's happening is these waves are collapsing into that counter space, and the energy is absorbed. So when your body's in that field, because it's an electrostatic field, it's an RF field, it's moving right through your entire body. Because every cell in your body, a little micro massage. So you have these micro currents going through your body, and your body's tuned to the resonance of, and you're sort of the capacitor in the electronic circuit. And so combining the sound with it, sound is like a pressure wave, it's a longitudinal wave. When you're hearing my vocal cords, excite the molecules in the air, that sound is traveling to you in a longitudinal wave, and when you hear it, your eardrum picks up the pressure, and it triggers your nervous system, and your brain interpolates that as to being spoken language. So the way we generate sound in a speaker is we use these frequencies. So this is a sine wave, basically, that goes positive and negative, and the distance in between the two peaks on the sine wave is considered the wavelength. So this is the frequency that you're listening to. Lower frequencies have long waves, and some of these frequencies and even sound waves are really long. And the amplitude is the intensity of how loud it is. If I was speaking how loud it is, it'll make the waveform go higher. And these are all nodes of compression and rarefaction. And this is the key to generating the type of waves that are being used in the Quantaphi. And we'll look at that where we can see it in a bit in the future. So there's these four basic shapes in these waveforms, and I knew them from electronics, and I was also a big fan of electronic music. I loved the early synthesizers and listened to like Pink Floyd and stuff like that when I was a kid. So when I got into electronics, I sort of followed what these synthesizers were doing, and that they were creating these basic tones. So I can play them for you here. We'll start with the triangle wave. And when I play these sounds, and I'll play them at different frequencies, so I'm just going to play these four different waveforms, and just when you hear them, take note of how you feel inside and what you feel from them. So this is a triangle wave, and this is almost 1 kilohertz. So I can bring this right down. Sounds like video games and stuff. The early video games, they were all based on these basic shapes, because the early computers could only generate these simple waveforms. So that's 1.5 kilohertz. 2 kilohertz. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then it'll go, most people's perception is only about there. It can go all the way up really high, and these speakers can't even properly reproduce it. So that's the triangle wave. Then we'll do the sine wave. This is the one you're familiar with, is the test tone that used to play on the TV screen, or warning, emergency broadcast system, right? It's like 280 hertz. Then the 1 kilohertz. Very high. Yeah. And then the square wave. And you notice how they kind of look like they sound. Like the triangle wave kind of sounds like a saw, like a buzzy, brassy. It's the brassy kind of sound. The sine wave's smooth, like a drum. Boo, boo, boo. The square wave is sharp. It's like on and off, on and off. Again, popular sound in the old video games. And then a sawtooth wave is kind of just a bent triangle wave, but it has a sharp rise and then a slow release. So just to go through them at the same frequency, that's the sawtooth wave. This is the sine wave. This is the square wave. And the triangle wave. So did anybody experience different feelings? Could you feel the difference between those sounds? Yeah, it's interesting. So what we always used in the Rife machines was the square wave, because that was the one that gave the punch. If you want a destructive frequency, we were always looking to get a really sharp rise time and just slam whatever it was we were targeting to hit. And so when the early makers of synthesized music started modifying these waves, they just were taking these sounds that you could see in an oscilloscope or had a signal generator to generate, because all electronics is based on those things. So a capacitor, when you add it into a circuit, it'll take a sine wave, which is basically what's coming out of your, it'll take it like a square wave, and it'll smooth it out and turn it into a sine wave, which is how AC electricity is transmitted. When Nikola Tesla created the first AC generator, what he saw in his mind, and this was the debate between DC and AC, when you see DC on one of these things, you just have a positive and a negative. It's a straight line. But Tesla saw this sine wave of this modulating waveform to transmit electricity, and what he realized was that we were going about it all wrong in the early days, because all we had was batteries, and it was Edison that wanted to have DC power transmissions. But the problem with DC is, because of the resistance in the lines, you could only get so far. So if you had all the houses on your street running on DC, the first house would be the brightest lights, and then they would get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer as they went. So the key to generating long-distance power transmission was to turn it into a sine wave. So a capacitor would basically put on your circuit and you could turn a square wave into a sine wave. And the computers and everything evolved out of this. And the early day sound synthesizers, basically you could select a knob and you could select the frequency. So you select your waveform, whatever you wanted, of these basic waveforms, and then you selected your frequency. And so everybody's probably familiar with these type of waveforms that you see on your computer or when your audio is playing. These are complex waveforms. When you listen to all the musical instruments at once, they are all molding together to create these modulating waves that have different force. Like this is a kick drum. You know, your kick drum falls on these doo, 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 doo. So you see those spikes in there, and then all the other instruments kind of modulate into this different waveforms. So everybody's kind of familiar with those. That one's out of order. Okay, so the early synthesizers. This was a Moog synthesizer that was created by Bob Moog, and he was an electronics guy who said, hey, why don't we take all this electronic stuff and build it into these box so we can make these sounds and have a way to control them. And in the beginning, he didn't have a keyboard on it. He just had all the knobs, and you just plugged in all the wires and you created your circuits and you turned the knobs to do things. And then he came up with this strip that was just like a resistance thing, so you had a variable resistor and you could slide your finger up and down and go woo, 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 like I was doing on this. And so between a combination of getting the right wires and turning the right knobs and moving your finger up and down on this thing, you could make these sounds. And somebody came along and said, hey, you got to make this more like an instrument that you can play, like a piano. And he said, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll take a piano keyboard and turn the keys into switches. And the switches could turn the switches at different frequencies, and then you could have you could play it like a keyboard. And that became the first synthesizer. It was Moog and a few other guys that were working on these kind of electronic things that developed them all at the same time. So with sounds, sounds create emotion. Just like all those little bits you felt, the square wave was really punchy and the sine wave was jarring, or the triangle wave was kind of jarring, and the sine waves are really smooth and has some kind of, you get good feelings from it. So with music and sound, it really is a big part of our way of being. And because we listen to music, and every musician knows you can control emotions through harmony and stuff. And discord, will create tension, and as you move up the scale, and your notes, if they're too close together, they won't be in resonance, so you create a tension. But if they're in harmonics and you create a chord, then it has a good feeling. But what's interesting is those sounds are also triggering chemical changes in your body. So all plants are, I talk about in the alchemy class that plants are basically like little chemical factories that create these phytochemicals that have health benefits and modify our bodies. Well, our bodies are doing that all the time. We're chemical manufacturing machines. And the way we can manufacture these chemicals is basically based on our environment. So we have this internal pharmacy that's capable of creating all these different chemicals. For instance, when you get scared or whatever and you have a flight or fight syndrome, your body secretes adrenaline and you're like, okay, I gotta go, and it gives you the power to get up and run from the tiger or whatever's chasing you. Or you do something good and you get something rewarding, like they've done with the like button on these things. See, these people who've programmed all the social media and stuff have played into this chemical manufacturing too. So the like buttons will release the serotonin and you get a little rush or whatever. Whenever you get some kind of something that's rewarding you, you get released serotonin. When you listen to music, especially if you get the right beat, it'll get a good dance beat going, you get out on the dance floor, and you release this adrenaline, and it helps you keep you awake. And then if you listen to soft, soothing music from strings and cellos and things like that, you can put you to sleep, and you'll produce noradrenaline. So the sounds that you hear and what music's doing is really affecting the chemical change in your body. And when we talk about, so this is a synthesizer. I build synthesizers now and make them out of these modular units. If we get time near the end, I'll play you some of the sounds that these things can generate, because it's really fun. And so now this is in the audible range, and this stuff's all well documented. We've known it from ancient times. You know, Mozart and Bach and everybody, the ancient music masters were masters of that. They could control your emotions and your feelings with music. Now, as soon as you get above, when I hit the, going up into the 20 kilohertz and up, and you started to lose your audio range where you don't hear it anymore, that's when we start to go from audible frequencies into what we call radio frequencies, because radio frequencies, you don't hear them, but they're there. So we all know from radio and TV and everything we've been using over the years and radio transmissions, these waves can penetrate walls. You can have a TV in your front room and you could receive the signal from outside. So they penetrate right through your body. They penetrate through solid concrete and windows a bit easier and stuff like that. And so we started working, and a lot of this stuff came out of the military, because in the war, being able to communicate, we had radios with frequencies that other countries didn't have, and so they couldn't tap the code, and we could send signals and say, all right, we're going to attack or do whatever. Then they started putting signals on those frequencies that became, the frequencies became a carrier wave, and they'd have a coded transmission. And starting with like Morse code, which was just a simple square wave, dot, 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 dash, 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 we started putting all these signals onto these RF waves and transmitting them. And the other advantage we have is we could transmit them to long distances. So with the early radios, the higher the frequency, it seemed, well, as we found different bands, some bands were more conductive to send signals all around the Earth. The signals go up into the ionosphere, up to the clouds and stuff, and they'll bounce down and bounce around the Earth. So we could talk with radios all around the world. And then, so more and more over the years, we just became RF crazy. We started with radio, with AM, and then FM, and then ham radios, and on and on and on. So those are all just different sections of the electromagnetic spectrum that we've designated as a certain bandwidths of frequency range. So AM sort of here, then frequent FM gets higher, and ham radio and all these other radios. So it all started in the kilohertz range, and then the megahertz range, and now we're in the gigahertz time, where we started being able to have processors that could make signals that went really, really fast. And the higher these frequencies, the more penetrating they can be, and the farther you'll transmit, and the more power they have. In a high-powered gigahertz amplifier, you can concentrate a lot of power. So the first microwaves came out. That's when you get into the microwaves. Once you get into gigahertz, that's what we call microwaves. So the microwave oven came out, and we realized that with a little bit of power, we could have a very high frequency that actually resonated the water molecules inside the water in your food, and you could cook food. You're exciting these molecules, and you're bending on the bonds. The water molecules, at 108 degrees with 2 hydrogens and oxygen, and you hit it with the microwave, and it takes the hydrogens and goes woo, 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 and those molecules all move, and that creates friction, and it creates heat, and it cooks your food. So we realized this in the early days, because radio operators that were positioned in a radio station that were near the antenna would get big headaches and things like that, and people would get sickness, and you could cause like an ionizing and non-ionizing radiation that would heat up tissue inside your body. And so then we developed the microwaves, and we could actually cook with things. And so we just kept going. We added those gigahertz frequencies going up to the 2.1 gigahertz, and we started including them in routers that for transmitting your Wi-Fi and things like that. And as we got more and more high processing power to create higher and higher frequencies, we just kept dumping this RF into the world. And now everybody carries, RF transmitting devices that these things transmit on multiple different frequencies in all these high bands and receive. And routers and cars and everything out there that runs on radio waves became more and more prevalent. But nobody looked at the health implications of what was going on until today. Of course, everybody's now aware because in the last few years, especially after 5G coming out, lots of people are saying, hey, wait a minute, well, what about the health effects of all these things? And the major corporations and everybody that's been creating this kind of stuff has always just said, oh yeah, no, it doesn't affect you whatsoever. Just like they are saying in the early days, oh, your body has nothing to do with electricity. Why are you making an electronic device that's going to affect your body in some way? But now we know, and this was a really good paper here that talks about some of the effects of the what's going on when you're exposed to this RF radiation. And it basically, because your nervous system is an electrochemical system, and your whole nervous system, your body and your spinal column, you are basically like a walking transceiver. So that means you can transmit and receive signals. So, and those signals can change the space in the room. So it's like when you walk into a room and somebody's had an argument, you feel that space even though they're not arguing, so you go in and you go, oh, there's like bad vibes in here. That kind of thing is still emanating, bouncing out from the anger that was happening from the people, and we've just naturally done that. We haven't really physically paid attention to it, but it's part of like body language and communication, and that you go into certain places and you can just feel what it is, or you go to like a church or a holy place or a spiritual thing or an ancient Stonehenge, places like that, you feel that energy because it's embedded in there. That's because we are these fractal antennas that can transmit and receive on all these different frequencies. So of course all this RF radio waves that we've been putting out there is affecting us. And the first thing that these people in this paper write about is how it works on our nervous system. And it also affects our endocrine system, so all the hormones. So when you feel those feelings that you feel from the sound or from music and that, there are different hormones that are being released that give you those different feelings. And so when we're just transmitting all these signals willy-nilly, and you're watching Netflix and a movie, you think about all that data and information that's flying through the air. Well, it's all of that's affecting your systems. So this ends up producing like oxidative stress in the body and has free radical damage, and ultimately your DNA are sort of a fractal antenna that is sort of a miniature microcosmic version of your whole nervous system, which is sort of a microcosmic version of the whole Earth, which is a microcosmic version of the whole solar system. So this scales, right out, like the alchemist said in the beginning. As it is above, so it is below. And this pattern repeats. And all these patterns have harmonic resonances that fit in with these frequencies. And so it actually can cause damage to DNA. If you get exposed to microwave radiation, and then when you get higher radiations like X-rays and things like that, then you can actually do genetic damage. And that's why if you do too many X-rays, you're actually not only causing all the first three here, the nervous system damage, the endocrine system, oxidative stress, but now you're really hitting the DNA, and that's when you'll get mutations and you get cancer being caused. Also, these RF frequencies increase the level of apoptosis, which is where your cell reaches a certain age, and every cell is basically programmed to die. So your cells die. So it increases the apoptosis where good, healthy cells die, and then cancer cells will actually be more reproductive. And that's what cancer cells have figured out, how to avoid the apoptosis. cancer cells never really die. They've overwritten that telomeres that are at the end of your DNA strands that tell your cell how long to live, and they just keep multiplying. And that's what cancer is a genetic mutation gone bad and a continued reproduction of cells that never die, and they just build up into a mass and causes a tumor. The other thing they found is that it lowered the fertility rate because of the hormone damage from radio waves, and the excessive intercellular calcium ion exchange and the calcium signaling that's in your nervous system. And it attacks the cells in your body, like I was saying, and eventually leads to cancer.
Would you say that last one was the one that they've been able to measure the most? The calcium signal?
Yeah, that was the first real indicator, because at the end of your synapses is an electrical charge where the signal gets passed from one nerve dendrite to the other, and there's a calcium ion exchange that happens there, and it's literally like an electric spark that relies on magnesium and calcium to generate the charge off there. And so they've broken it down really well here. So the voltage gate calcium channels, so they took these microwave and lower frequencies, and that was the thing that led them into this. And then they realized that calcium ion exchange, because it does do many things. This calcium signaling produced these physical effects which ended up causing free radicals, the oxidative stress, and ultimately inflammation. So that's the key. When you see and you have inflammation in your body, you know that, especially chronic inflammation, that's how disease occurs. Wherever there's inflammation, there'll always be disease. And it usually is because of this pathway in this case. And then there's good pathways that your body's always trying to naturally do, produce nitrous oxide signals, proteins, and so there's ways of making, so not all frequencies and all these things are bad, and this is what I've been telling people for many years, because why can you get good positive results from devices like this, and yet negative results from uncontrolled one? And everybody would say things like, well, it's the frequency. You're just attuned to a bad frequency, or if you play a bad frequency, bad things can happen, and there's good frequencies that will heal things. But that's sort of a simplistic way of looking at it. It's not really about the frequencies, it's more about what the frequencies are carrying, and it's more about the noise. So when you listen to those pure sine waves, that's basically what's coming out of your here in the UK, it's 50 hertz. In the US and North America, it's 60 hertz. So it's oscillating at a sine wave of 60 hertz. So people would say, yeah, that 60 hertz is bad. And 50 hertz is, some people said 50 hertz was better than 60 hertz, so it's better to live in Europe than North America. But it's not about the frequency, it's more about the noise. Every time we put something on this line and plug something in, we change the circuit, and the circuit that's delivering the power to your house, everything gets changed. And the biggest culprits are these little things, these switching transformers. They're in everything. They started in the computers, and they slowly became connected to every device. All your cell phone chargers, all those things, these make a lot of noise, and they put a lot of noise, and they emit a lot of RF just from those alone. So what I've always said is, don't blame the frequency, blame the noise kind of thing. So the more things we plug into the circuits, the more noise we create. And it's that incoherentness of the noise that's the problem. So when you look at a spectrum analyzer and you're outside of the city and you're not near anything, you look at background radiation of the cosmos, because there's just RF from everywhere. Yeah, everything from, signals that are coming from other galaxies and things like that. So we're embedded in these frequencies. And when you listen to what they call white noise, just the static, like shh, like in the old days when you tuned your radio in between or your television set to a channel that didn't have it, you just saw those white specks and black and white specks, that went. Part of those are from, some of those dots that showed up on the screen were original transmissions from the original Big Bang that are still bouncing around the universe. And so there's all this white noise. And when you look at, when you're out in the country and you're not near any power lines or houses or anything, you look at a spectrum analyzer, you just get white noise. And that's basically a wide band of every single frequency from really low to really high that's all sort of in tune. But as soon as you turn on a radio transmitter, what happens is you look at the spectrum analyzer, it goes boot, and one peaks up. So you got all these little guys and then your strong carrier wave. That's your signal that you're transmitting. So what we were trying to do in the early days was make a strong signal with a square wave that was in resonance with these things that could target these viruses and bacteria. So it kind of led down this lower path for those small things, but not for the larger things, because your bigger cells are a little bit more robust, and the frequencies, so smaller things like viruses and bacteria and stuff like that, are weaker, and they can be destroyed without destroying the human cells. So that was the original destructive frequency type devices, the Rife type frequencies that we were targeting. And what I call these devices are constructive frequency devices. So when, Dan came up with the algorithm of the Planck's length and using phi ratio in the frequencies of nature, and said, can you make some kind of machine that can use these frequencies? It was like, oh, okay, we can combine all this stuff and throw it into what became the Theraphi, which included the electromagnetic side and the photonic emission and things. All the things that I've been building for years are basically just rolled into one machine. And so I call that field that generates constructive frequencies, because it's using frequencies of nature, and it's more supportive to the upper pathway there where we have therapeutic effects. So 5G now we are moving from these 1 gigahertz machines where we are putting into microwaves and using smaller radios and things like that. The more and more advanced our electronics become, and the faster we can make machines go, the faster we can make these signals. So now 5G is considered, anywhere up into the 5 gigahertz range, but all the way up into the 10 gigahertz range. And we've been able to create radio transmitters. In the old days, they were only used in military purposes, because for war, of course, you had to have the advantage of being ahead of the enemy so you could transmit your signals. So all this stuff was developed through military technology, and they were operating on these 5 to 10 gigahertz frequencies 20, 30 years ago. But all this stuff just kind of trickles down from the military industrial complex, and eventually we get cell phones and things that keep us entertained. And then, so now 5G is the big thing, and everybody wants to have everything run on 5G and be interconnected. So every single camera, every car, everything all communicates. Like it's great in theory, but the problem is we're adding more and more of these waves into our atmosphere. And people also didn't like the looks of, cell towers, and people were afraid to live next to one because they'd heard stories about, the negative health effects. So they got clever, and they're like, well, let's start disguising these antennas as trees. And there's some really neat ones that they put up in wherever you have it. Like this one blends right in really nicely. You drive by it and never know it was there, but it's a major tower. So these frequencies could all be transmitted, through wires, as we started out in the solids. So we have the 3 states of matter, basic states of matter, solids. So we started out transmitting these things through wires. Personally, I think fiber optics are the way to go, transmitting through light and sending signals like that, because we can send very fast signals, because there's a limitation to copper wires of how much bandwidth we can push through them. But then when we realized we could go RF, we started transmitting through gases, and these basically the 3 states of matter. And what I'm doing with these type of devices is taking it to another level beyond the RF. The RF gets captured into the fourth phase of matter, which is plasma. So as soon as you have a gas, so in a solid, like you see here, all your molecules are kind of locked together. So metals and everything are really like a crystalline matrix grid of strongly locked molecules. In liquids, they're held together by hydrogen bonds, and hydrogen bonds aren't as strong. So you have your covalent bonds, which is, if this was a water molecule, you'd have an oxygen here with a covalent bond to a hydrogen and a covalent bond to another hydrogen that gives you H2O. Then these hydrogens bond to each other through a weak bond, which is called a hydrogen bond, and those bonds can make and break, so they move in a fluidity. So anytime you have a liquid and you pour it, those bonds make and break, and they're doing it, billions of times a second in these liquid solutions. And the thicker the liquid, the slower those bonds, the more attracted those bonds are. So if you have molasses or syrups and things like that, they're held together more. In the gaseous state, the molecules are independent and they can float around individually. And in noble gases, like we use in these tubes, these atoms from the gases, they actually don't like to stick to each other. So hydrogen basically bonds with everything. The most abundant element in the universe is hydrogen. Everything's coated with hydrogen. Hydrogen just sticks and it's everywhere and it's all over. Every time you see a chemical formula where they'll have like a six-sided like benzene ring of carbons and you have a couple other elements on the chain, basically at every point is just a hydrogen, and the hydrogen just sticks to everything and floats around. So that's how gases are kind of floating around. And then the next fourth stage of matter is where you actually have ionization, where the gases release, where the molecules in the gases release their electrons, and every time an electron jumps off the outer shell, it releases a photon, and that's what we see as light. So that's why you see different noble gases on the far right of the periodic table. They all have different colors. So you have red and blues and all the neon signs. You remember in the early days we made neon signs from that, and they were just basically plasma. Plasma is nothing rare and special and things like that. It's quite common in your fluorescent lights or plasma, even flames in like a candle and stuff like that. There's plasma is basically everywhere. The sun itself is a big ball of plasma that's emitting the energy that comes to the earth and gives life. Lightning builds up from charge, and all this based on charge again. It's all electrical phenomena, right? Your ionosphere charges up, and the Earth is sort of the ground, the counter space to that charge, and boom, lightning strikes, and it discharges between the two things, and that's when we have lightning. And so this whole thing about, I also have built a lot of different type free energy, quote, free energy devices over the years, and always went down that road of looking at how do we create energy. And then people I knew that were engineers and stuff would say, well, second law of thermodynamics, and energy can't be created or destroyed, and there's no such thing as free energy. And I'd always argue back to him, I say, actually all there is free energy. We live in an infinite sea of energy. There's nothing but energy. It's just somebody was smart enough to put a meter on your house and charge you for it. But anytime we cause a protuberance in the ether, energy manifests. So that's what's happening when lightning breaks down. The charge builds up, and then we have to go back to ether theory. I said that word there. In the early days, a lot of scientists believed in this idea that the ether was sort of a medium, which was like a matrix that all this stuff is embedded in. And then as soon as we started realizing that there's a vacuum in space and all these things, they discounted the ether theory and just went to the atomist idea where things just move through like cogs in a machine. The whole universe works in this Newtonian type machine, and everything is a result of something else. But we're going back to that now. We're starting to realize that we need, in order to understand what's happening, how the quantum physicists talk about quantum mechanics and things like that, we have to go back to that understanding of the ether and how everything is kind of connected together in that ether. And then that's sort of the matrix that holds all these things together. So plasma is a big part of it, and everything that was created in the universe was created from plasma. Right now, the plasma is 99.9% of everything we know is in a plasma state, which is a highly energized state. So we've come to use electricity to create plasma to emulate things like lights and stuff like that. But when you get out into the cosmos and you study astrophysics, you realize that every star you see in the sky is all plasma, and they're all connected together through light threads. And everything has these light tubes all throughout the cosmos that hold the whole universe together like a giant web. In ancient Vedic philosophy, it was called Indra's net. So the idea of Indra's net was there's a net, and that net you could say would be the ether. And at every node where the net meets, there's a sphere that reflects every other sphere in that net, and it's all a fractal, recursive matrix of this. And so that's what we live in the cosmos. Everything is intimately tied together through these light waves. And when you have sunspots and, like we have had these, they call them solar flares that come off the thing, and you have different ranges of flares. When you have an X-class flare, that means the solar radiation, the plasma, that's a plasma jet that's literally spewing out of the sun, and it usually comes out in a spiral because everything through the universe, all these light tubes are connected through these spiraling filaments. And they usually spiral in pairs, and whenever you create enough energy and tension between two things, you end up getting these twisted pairs of spirals. So when you see some of these flares from the SOHO that's looking at the sun, you'll see these double helix spirals. They're a fractal macro version of our DNA spiral. And these continuous idea, because we live in this polarity of positive and negative charge, all this positive and negative charge from the electric universe, this is just not naturally how, because anytime a charge moves or you have a current moving, that current moves in a stream, it creates a magnetic field as part of it. So the right-hand rule in electricity is if your current is running this way, your magnetic field is coiling around it this way. So when you have two of these charges moving, they create a magnetic field that creates a spin. And everything in the universe is in continuous motion and continuously spinning. So as these plasma jets come out from the sun and we have an X-class flare, that's pulling tons of radiation out of the sun. And when I say radiation, you've got to realize that not all radiation is bad. Everything on life, and from plants and photosynthesis and chlorophyll and everything's all using this radiation to make energy and transmit energy from the sun, from these rays into chemicals that are in the plants that we eat, that we live, and we live with all this stuff. But at times it can get really rocky, and when the X-class flares come out to the sun, they can actually reach all the way to the Earth. But the Earth has its own plasma protection shield called the Van Allen belt. And if you've ever seen a picture of the Earth where it has this sort of curved thing like this as it's moving through space, that electromagnetic field that's generated from the Earth, because again, the Earth's spinning, and again, it has a north and a south pole. Again, it's a duality, and it's using the positive and negative of the charge, and that's the principle that is created with the Theraphi and the Quantaphi. That's why it has two poles. That positive and negative charge create that tension and create that field in there. So it's emulating nature. The biggest thing that lesson I learned from Victor Schauberger and people like Tesla, and that was always like, and the alchemists of old, was they were always trying to emulate nature and then accelerate nature. So if you had to make a very powerful medicine, you would start with plants that had medicinal properties, let's say. And you separated the charges in those plants, so you'd separate them into their alchemical principles. And then you would refine those principles and put them back together. And so you're working in harmony with nature to make things better. So essentially, what the Theraphi and Quantaphi are doing is using all these natural principles combined into the photonic emission that are the result of the photons emitting from the plasma, the magnetic fields that are counterbalanced, one is north and one is south, and the electrical charges, and you're creating this field in a controlled manner that you can control with your frequency inputs. So plasma itself, as I was saying, is 99.9% of the universe. Oh yeah, so let's go back to that X-class flare. So the X-class flare is what's feeding the Earth. Continuously there's a sun's emanation coming from the sun. And that's just in our solar system. If you go zoom out again a bit more to the Milky Way, and then you have this spiraling galaxy, just jump ahead. Again, it's another fractal recursion of this massive amounts of energy that's controlling this system. So when the X-class flare hits the Earth, we see it as what we call the northern lights, the aurora borealis, and the poles light up like light, and it dances. And that's tons of energy coming into the Earth. So if the X-class flare is strong enough, the first thing that's vulnerable, any electronics is vulnerable, and that's why ham radio operators and radio transmitters would always wait for the right solar conditions. You could transmit further, and you had bad solar flares and things like that. You couldn't send or we couldn't receive signals very well. You could send them, but they get distorted by these fields. When these solar emissions hit get transmitted from the sun, come through our solar system, and they hit the poles, it lights up. That's plasma that you see dancing in the air, and it can be quite colorful in that. And the amount of energy that's available there is gazillions and gazillions and gazillions of watts of power. So, as I say, we live in this infinite sea of energy. The key to free energy and free energy devices is not that you're making a machine that, has a 9-volt battery, and then all of a sudden you're getting, with 5 watts of power, that you're getting 50 watts of power out of the other side of the machine. The key to free energy is to tap into all the free energy, ambient energy that's all around us. So these devices, that's what I've always looked for when I look at these type of things. I'm looking for something that is able to move in such a mechanical way that's pulling more energy, and it's not coming from that battery that you're starting with to make more power. It's coming from the ambient surroundings. And for instance, the best free energy machine is the generator that Nikola Tesla built and put at Niagara Falls. That was his dream. His dream someday when he was a kid was to harness the energy of Niagara Falls to provide people with energy. And when he finally had that eureka moment where he realized that it had to be done through spinning magnetic fields, because he was emulating nature. Everything in nature had a pole, it had to have 2 poles, and it had to spin like nature. The problem with DC, what Edison was doing, you had a battery bank, it just held a charge separated by metal plates and acid, basically. So the first battery was a copper plate and a nickel plate, and you put it in acid or a base or something like that, charges separate and it go. But it doesn't spin, it just separates the charge. The genius from Tesla was that he realized that it had to emulate nature, so he had to have the charge, which they had with the battery, but it had to spin. And when he put the spin on it, that spinning rotation that was caused by the force of the water that turned the turbine and spun the electromagnetic core and the magnetic fields in the copper generated the electricity, and that's it. So really, when you think about it, that energy, where is it coming from? And you can stump any physicist, electrical engineer, or anybody you want. You just say, okay, so yeah, the electricity gets generated at the generator, but where is it coming from? And they'll say, well, it's from the copper conductor that moves through the magnetic field. Yeah, but where's the actual electroenergy fin? And the other one that stumps them is, what is a field? because they can't define a field, and fields are what are created by this type of thing when it's emitted and it's in the surrounding area. But they say, well, a field is, and then they'll go back to describing when a conductor moves through a magnetic field, and then you say, well, you can't explain what a field is by saying a field kind of thing. So it's just something you could do if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of all this. The term plasma, it's...
Just going back to your last slide.
Yeah.
All the feng shui practitioners in the room are going, oh, that's a green dragon.
Yeah, this is a green dragon, yeah. And I use that one because it's got the face in there, but same with the clouds and all that. And on a metaphysical level, when you get into people like John Dee and people who were doing, or even on a feng shui, on a Taoist level, working with the elementals in a druid way, all these things, they understood that the manifestation of a certain personality or certain character or certain archetypes could come from nature. So these ideas of the elementals or a dragon in the sky like this, and we...
There are various cosmological, astrological... Through the time spiral.
Yeah, exactly. So to dismiss that from a modern scientist rational point of view, saying, yeah, that was all myth and they were superstitious and all these kind of things, when you understand these fundamental principles of nature, then all of a sudden it makes these things very real. And they have these energetic qualities, they have these archetypical qualities, even the signs of the zodiac and all these things. And when you're born and the influence that your stars have on you, it's firmly grounded in science. And that's where science and religion, once split at one time, and they just had to take two different paths for a while. But that's where it's all kind of meshing back together, because the science is proving the spiritual side of things, and the spiritual side is starting to make sense now when you kind of tie it in. And it becomes very powerful. The more you know and understand those systems, the more you can use those systems for your own benefit, as in feng shui and all these things, working with and understanding nature. Okay, all right, good. Thanks for the reminder, because we're going forever. So let's fire up let's just cover Irving Langmuir again. We see him here with his early with the X-ray tube, but these guys all looked at this stuff when they excited trapped gases and were able to capture and manipulate plasma. He was the one who named it plasma. And he said he called it plasma because it's like blood plasma, that we called the original liquid around the red blood cells, the plasma that were in your blood. I don't know the origin of where we call blood plasma from. That's a good one, I should look it up. But he named this gaseous plasma after plasma because he said it's alive. It's living, just like the dragon here, right? And it has a consciousness, and it can do things, and it can move, and it has capabilities of transmitting. And he was a real rational, scientific guy. And to say something like this is in the early 1900s. He was around, so he was a contemporary of Tesla and Crookes, and Sir William Crookes was the one who came up with the capturing gases in a tube like this called the Crookes tube. And so he was like the mentor for Nikola Tesla, and all these guys got together and discussed this stuff intimately and came up with these, concepts kind of working together.
What was his name?
Irving Langmuir. Yeah. Yeah, this is in his... Yes. Yeah. And this is in his older age, but interesting guy. And I think I got Crookes in here. So plasma, and then Sir William Crookes, who basically invented the Crookes tube, which you've probably seen. That's what I modeled the Theraphi tubes and the Quantaphi tubes off. And then because he had this angle, and because everything initially came out in the Theraphi, everything was phi ratio. So I took the base width of 1 and then took the angle 1.618 on the sloping angle of the tube to create a phi ratio cone. So basically the tube is like on a pentagram, it's the arms on the pentagram. And that ratio is amazing because when you have the pentagram angle at 108 degrees, well, that's the same angle as the bond angle in the water. It can fluctuate plus or minus 15 degrees as well. And that's why the ancient Greeks, the phi was the sacred thing, and the dodecahedron was the sacred platonic solid that was the secret, and the secret key to everything was through the phi ratio, because that's just what was right in front of everybody's eyes in nature alone. So all these things and all this background kind of got combined into these wonderful machines, which is the Theraphi. So that's how you lay in between the Theraphi to get the effects of both the tubes. And it's a larger box than the Quantaphi. And the Quantaphi is a smaller amplifier that you can use audio in to modulate the magnetic fields and the plasma. And you can set many tubes around these coils, and you create these antenna patterns. So if you want to transmit your fields, and what we're probably going to do when we go up to Skipton there is set up 6 different coils. You can add coils and add tubes, and we'll put, you can put 6 or 8 tubes on each coil. So we're going to really charge up the room. We've only got 2 of them here today, but you can add to them. Yeah, exactly. And so some early prototypes of the original Theraphi tubes. And what's amazing with these things is animals just have this intuitive, I'm going there. Cats, dogs, they'll sit, they find the sweet spot, and they always go to the center. Even if they're on the floor and you got your tubes up on the center, they'll on the stands, they'll find the center. They're not going to lay at one end and get the positive side or the negative side. They find the sweet spot in the center. And of course, I designed the logo after the Egyptian the hieroglyphs at Dendera in the Hathor temples. There's been a big thing about this over the years. People are like, they're light bulbs. They had light bulbs and electricity because the electricity was showing, as the ancients used the serpent as a meaning linked to energy. The Egyptian archaeologists, of course, argued, no, they didn't have electricity. That's absurd. This was the lotus flower, which is the lotus here. But the serpent that runs up underneath, coming from the jed's always been a symbol of the power and strength, and the jed of Osiris. So here it is connected to the serpent, which is connected to the lotus, which is like the cathode inside of the tube. If you want to call it the tube, they say this is the womb of Nut or Nui, and but it just kind of, people have been saying ever since they've seen these, ever since light bulbs came about, I guess, that, hey, this thing really looks like a light bulb, and it kind of makes a lot of sense.
Well, also, don't forget, there's no carbon residue from
torches and
Roman,
that's right.
Anywhere on the pyramid.
In any of those temples.
If they were,
if they're in there painting.
You think there'll be carbon everywhere.
Yeah,
No, they were using
that's right. So, or some method of creating light because I think we will eventually move beyond this, where we are now. In the future, we'll be able to just light the atmosphere in a room using the same kind of technology in a more in a healing way. And that was Tesla's thing too. Tesla said, I'll provide free energy to everybody, and the energy I transmit will be healing, and the earth will flourish, and the trees will grow, and the people will be healthy. Rife said the same thing. Now that I know the key, I can erect big towers in the city, and no one will ever get disease again. So we will find that way, and through these resonances, and once we understand the difference between creating destructive, noisy frequencies and healthy frequencies and ways of powering things, we can do that. So crazily enough, I've built all kinds of different plasma tubes for many years, different shapes, sizes, and stuff like this. So this is just the Theraphi's on the table, and I took one of my old tubes, and this tube is like 30 years old. And I was just like, okay, let's just see what's in here. I didn't even know what gases were in it. And it created this serpent inside the tube, and it's got a little purple head, and it's got a tail like a rattlesnake, and it had the curve. So I'm going to get a bit bigger. The next tube I'm going to blow is a bit bigger and make the actual replications of that sort of serpent inside the bigger tube like that. But then you zoom into the tail, the tip of the tube where it's got pinched off, and sure enough, here's these harmonic nodes again. Every time you see these compression, rarefaction, remember the sound waves? This is how the longitudinal waves are working. When those longitudinal waves meet in the center in the counter space, that's when you have the scalar field effect. You hear a lot of people talking about scalar this, scalar that, scalar pendant, scalar blah, blah, blahs. The real definition of that is those combination of how these longitudinal fields meet to collapse, and that's when you generate this scalar thing. If you do it in a twisting motion, like the Russians called spintronics, or what's the other name of the spinning vortexes? When you move it into spinning vortexes, that's when the magic happens, and that's what's really happening in these tubes. Is it's spinning vortexes of longitudinal waves that braid together, and
folks, just
yeah.
what Paul's saying here, that the term scalar is used left, right, and centre.
Yeah.
And they're not creating scalar waves.
Mm-hmm.
It's become a loose term.
Yeah.
You can see what it takes to actually create scalar waves.
Yeah.
So don't be fooled by the propaganda, oh, it's a scalar.
Yeah.
Well, at least look into it and ask the right questions.
Yeah. Everybody talk about it, but nobody stands. Scalar is like a term we use for vectors and things like that, but that vector collapse in the real sweet spot that's in the center is where two opposing, when you saw the sine wave there, the positive and negatives meet, and that collapse happens. That's when that moves like superluminally, and that field gets pushed out. It's more a field than a wave, I guess. And I got a really good example.
The universe operates.
Yeah, real quickly I can show you a video of how that works. So this is a fluorescent tube. The other thing that you just place a fluorescent tube in the field of the Theraphi, and it just lights right up. So you got wireless electricity. There's no wires going to this tube. And if I adjust the settings just right, there's your longitudinal waves.
Pump waves.
Yeah, emulating or going into, it goes in both directions. It depends on how fast the camera is to capture them. But that's the compression and the rarefaction, just like that's the longitudinal wave moving through it. And that counter space point at the center of the tube where, depending on how your eye sees it, you'll see it going towards the center or emanating from the center. But there's that definite center point right in the middle there.
And don't forget, that's every cell in your body, mitochondria.
That's right.
Everything is that. It's not a sine.
Because it's fractal.
It's this.
And it's
longitudinal.
Yeah.
Every chemical reaction.
Yeah.
And the communication of the meridians, everything.
Yeah.
It's not a sine wave.
And as it is above, so it is below, because the plasma is the perfect fractal antenna, and it just goes, infinitely inward and infinitely downward, because those molecules, you're talking at a transmission of a rarefaction and compression down to the molecular level. So here you see it on the large scale, all those rarefactions and compressions, and then just picture it down at a small scale where you get this microcosmic.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but it's a little technical, but the part of the secret sauce is what's called time reversal.
Yeah, you see the reversal happening in the way your eye sees it going back and forth. these waves that bounce back off the wall here are time reversed polarity waves that are coming from this in an electronic sense. And in a cellular sense, it's kind of like every cell in your body has the original blueprint, the original DNA that created you, that link back to the 8 original cells from when you were created, that are down near your down chin or the base of your spine. Your body has that divine blueprint, and this is what Callie's part of her, when she guides people through the meditative process in the Theraphi, that's what she refers back to. So you remember that original blueprint. So, yeah. Do you want to say it? Those are, some of the side benefits that we started realizing is like, wow, this is like a manifestation machine. You get in there and concentrate. A lot of people, like Callie was saying, the sports people would come, and we had people in clinics that would train professional golf players to practice their swing in the Theraphi field, or the Quantaphi, if you will. And they would just do the visualizing of hitting that perfect ball and the perfect thing and landing hole in one or whatever. And we have one guy in Vancouver who took a semi-professional golf player to professional level through doing visualizations in the Theraphi. We've had people say, I use it for, manifesting things or sending out prayers and all kinds of things, because you're really tapping into the field of creation. You've got the plasma, you've got the positive and negative, you've got the spin, you got it. That's it. So what we're doing now, we've got it fired up, and basically any sounds that we play, you can play through the speaker. So if you want to do Tibetan chants or select some of these rife type frequencies, I really moved away from the single frequency thing many years ago and like to use more complex waveforms because you can pack more into it. And I moved away from the destructive things. Initially, I used to just build plasma tubes that were driven with a square wave that just went on and off, bang, 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 with a single frequency. And that's how all the rife type machines and everything are working like that. It's going to take a while. I think people are starting to catch up. It's amazing what's happening with the biohackers and all these people and a lot of electronic people. And amazing how much I see the influence now, 10 years later, of what people got from the Theraphi and future visions and people making new electronics and electromagnetic shielding devices and stuff and incorporating some of these same ideas. So it's really been great to see that grow and have this thing. But now, all of a sudden, it's the latest rage. You go to any of these, biohacking type longevity conferences and things like this, and there's many, many electro type devices out there. People are studying them at an academic level and a medical level. And so it's a really exciting time to be alive. I mean, we truly live in one of the greatest times of human history, because to have access to this type of information, for one thing, information was always held hostage from us by the controlling people, because information is power, and if you want to gain control, well, you keep the people stupid basically and tell them what to do, and then keep the information for yourself. Well, you make billions of dollars. But now we live in an age where that information is thanks to the internet and this outward flow of everything. And hopefully we can maintain that and keep that, because that's what's going to help us move into the future. And it's really important now in these times of, it seems like everything is very divisive and we live in this polarity nature. So polarities are being used against us to divide us and split us apart. But it's technologies like this and information like this that will help us realize that we are all one, and we're all connected and intimately connected through the light tubes, like the plasma and the fields and the transceiving antennas that we are. And nothing can affect anything individually, so everything gets affected in this great chain of Indra's net. If you will. And so I'm really hopeful that these shaky times that we're in right now is just the wake-up call. I mean, we've moved through these cycles over and over and over again, and what we're about to come out of on the other side of what we've been through for the last few years is pretty darn exciting, because the potential is there for us. We are infinite beings, and we're these transmitting, connected to the cosmos, light beings. When we realize our full potential, and that's why the powers that shouldn't be, that's their biggest fear, is that we actually put all this together and realize, holy smokes, it's all connected and all that. When we do that, we are unlimited in our potential, and we can do anything and go anywhere and be everything. Yeah. So,
Then we'll do some questions.
yeah. What's the key and how does it work? What's the secret to it all? Well, it comes down to music again. When you're listening to music and you got something with a beat, you start tapping your foot, nodding your head. The body naturally entrains to what it's exposed to, its environment. So all the chemicals and everything that we're talking, your body being a chemical manufacturing, those chemicals are based on your environment. Is something bad happening? Is a lion chasing you through the woods? Then you are going to have adrenaline and you're going to run away. Or are you with your mother and you're a baby and you're breastfeeding and you're getting that rush of oxytocin from the chemicals that are happening from that. So the music is doing the same thing. And the Wi-Fi and everything that we don't see, maybe I can show you one little video that is putting out the noise. And if you actually heard that noise, you'd realize, wow, then this can't be good. So this is what's being emitted from your router. And you listen to these things. You hear that? It sounds like screaming demons, and it's continuously going. All the electronic things, and I'm just walking slowly towards my router, and it's getting stronger, and those spikes are signals. And this is just sitting doing nothing. The computer's not on, but if you're watching a movie on Netflix or listening to music or whatever, there's tons of more data and noise flying down that thing. It's like a pack of screaming demons 24/7. So now your body, instead of the nice beat that you were listening to the music training to, you don't know it, but every cell in your body is training to that all the time. So the principle behind this and how it works is that now you can play compatible frequencies that your body likes. You can play some nice music or tones or anything like that. Your body will lock to this before it will lock to the noise. So you're playing, Tibetan monks chanting in here, then your body is going to lock to that because your body differentiates between the signal. The other thing is, your body doesn't want the same thing all the time. So even if you were playing a consistent frequency of like 1 kilohertz or whatever, it'll have an effect that's positive in the beginning, but then after a while it gets annoying to all the cells in your body and it'll become a negative effect. So definitely all the RF noise and all that stuff is negative to your body. So what it's doing is providing something for your body to lock to instead of that. So it's not negating it, it's not blocking it. There's a lot of people with devices out there that say it blocks EMF and things like that. Well, if you had something that blocked the EMF, then your phone wouldn't, you stuck it on your phone and it blocks the EMF, well, your phone just wouldn't work. There's some clever devices out there now that people are coming up with that are using fractal circuit patterns and things like this. I like those because what they're doing is they're taking the RF that's being emitted off of your phone and they're converting it into a more coherent pattern. So that's basically what it is the coherent waveforms that you're now putting out. Your body naturally locks to something more coherent, because just like you're listening to music and you want to tap your foot, it's because your body's always wanting to lock into these rhythms. We were born in these rhythms. Before we had electricity and Wi-Fi and all this, we were more influenced by the rhythms of nature. That's why the ancient stone builders and all these people were connected with the cosmos and understood everything, could build stone structures that reinforced and amplified that. So when you went to these places, you received very powerful healings because it was collecting all that energy from nature and concentrating in one spot. And basically, this is what we're doing in a modern sense, is creating this energy concentration center that is more coherent and more compatible with your body. Your body naturally locks to that than the noise that's out there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, two parts to the first one is that, you spend most of your time sleeping at home in your bed. That's your most important area to protect. That's when your body's most vulnerable because you are completely, unconscious at that point, so really susceptible to all these things. You can gain enough from the times you were at home with this thing. Am I working on something that can be portable? I've thought about it. I don't have any immediate things like that. I've got a few little things like those coil resonator transformers kind of thing. But yeah, possibly that's the next step. There's several projects on the bench that have been back burner projects for a long time that will be add-ons and that to these. So yeah, a possibility. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're the ones, when they first fired up 5Gs in places in Europe, like birds were dropping out of the air, things like that. So they're really susceptible to these things too. So yeah, I ultimately I envision a day like Tesla and that where we can just power, everybody has free access to as much energy as they need, and that power is always transmitting these resonant frequencies to keep everything in harmonic balance. Because if you think of it, before we came along and just started taking elements from the earth and making all this crazy stuff that we make, everything kind of ran. Nature, functions. It doesn't have to, animals don't pay for food or farm food or anything like that. It's just everything is provided by nature. So in order to go back into resonance with nature someday, that's my ultimate vision, I suppose, to achieve something like that where it could restore everything.
Did you want to comment on the second part of the question?
And the divine part of it, just my brief quick, is that we will naturally lead back to that because we all came from the one thing through the one thing, and we'll go back to the one thing. So as part of that, but yeah, Kelly might say something on that too. Yeah. It varies. These little tubes pretty well last a long time. We've had them going for years. I've got tubes like that old serpent tube there that's, 30 years old now. But it affects other things. You can put liquids in there and it affects the liquids, water, wine. Yeah. The wine tastes better. Well, the first time I was playing with the first setup, and I set up the Quantaphi, I was eating something. I had just made dinner, and I had the tubes on either side of the table, and I sat down in front of it, and when I had a metal spoon in my hand, and I put it in my mouth, I was like, wow, this tastes great. And I was like, wait a minute, it tastes better in the field. So that tagline at the beginning, that's what I came up with. Everything's better in the field. Because the food was tasting better. And yeah, if you treat your water or your wine in there, yeah, you can do that too. Yeah, most people get 2 tubes for each side. I like that too because you can fan them out or you can use them as a waveguide like an antenna to point them into different directions. So, sorry, the next was?
My question was answered. I was wondering how many do we need
Oh, okay.
to have in the house?
Yeah. Well, the 2 are fine, but the more you add, some people like to play with them and point them in different directions and stuff like that. So, yeah, 2 works fine. When you put 2 on the one coil, then what you can do is you stretch out that field. So, like I was saying, each coil creates sort of a toroidal field around it that is a circle when you're looking down on it that superimposes into the vesica, and as you put anything on the field, it distorts the field. So you can change when you put 2 tubes on it, you can spread it out more like a fan shape. Well, the oldest, easiest things were crystals and things like that people use for many years. Selenite is a really good crystal. You can make these, the very simplest thing you can do is make them into capacitors and use layers of something organic and inorganic around it and make like a little capacitor around, or just wearing the stones themselves, because just like the tubes on the coil, it distorts the field, and so crystals naturally do that. They bring chaotic, incoherent fields into coherence. That's why we use crystals as timekeeping. You got your quartz crystal watch. Remember, like the crystal pulses and it keeps accurate time because it's bringing things into coherence. So that's on the simplest level. Some of the things, there's some things out there that, and even I've seen that are making fabrics with certain weaves of silver threads and things like that seem to be pretty good. Yeah, so there's some of those things out there that are really good. And I mean, you kind of just do your research. And the other one is, if you do your research on other products, you know, ask other people who have them or read their reviews and things like that, and you can get a pretty good idea of what works and what isn't. Yeah, so Gina? Yeah, well, that's what's interesting about this, because you can use a single frequency on this. In fact, I haven't talked about it much, but my favorite pulsing Rife machine is the Spooky 2. I don't know if everybody's familiar with it, but it's spooky2.com. You can find it, their website. It really means spooky squared because they named it after Einstein saying it's like spooky action at a distance, because these have this quantum effects to them. Yeah, it's an entanglement. And this is another thing people have been doing with the Theraphies and this as well, is if you have a witness from somebody, like a hair or a fingernail or something like that, you can put it in the field and it will affect them remotely. And that's what, this quantum entanglement is what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. But anyway, out of all the different simple frequency generators, I recommend that. So you can get a Spooky 2 and you can connect it directly into the back of here, and you can run all those frequencies on here. So you have a spooky-like effect in the plasma. And it rounds out, the nice thing about plasma is it's a natural filter that kind of takes those square waves and smooths them out and makes them a little more tolerable. So it's a nice addition to add a Rife machine. So you can run Rife type frequencies on it, short answer, and as well as complex waveforms too. That's another misnomer that, you know, people are like, well, the liver is this frequency and the heart is this frequency. It's like so complicated on all these frequencies, as you see in the complex waveforms, the way it lay over top. So even though you smell a rose essential oil and it resonates with the heart, I mean, the complexity of all those molecules in those frequencies is the same thing. Rose is not just one frequency. It's a harmony, it's a symphony, right? Absolutely. And this is where I think we'll go. I think we're gonna, the idea of the pharmaceutical model in modern medicine is sort of a Newtonian mechanical thing. We think of chemicals that, oh, if we put this chemical in it, it will turn this wheel to change this cog to treat this disease. So I think where we'll go in the future is exactly that. The cellular differential, where you can create stem cells, can be anything in your body. It's all about resonance, and it's more than just a voltage too. It's about the frequency, right? You got to have the voltage, the frequency, and that harmonic resonance. And it reminds me of bees, because bees know how to do this. When bees create a hive, they make the wax, they make certain cells for the male drones and certain cells for the females. But then when they want to make a queen cell, they make it as a phi ratio egg shape, right? And so it's all about the environment. It's the exact same initial larvae that gets put in there, but that larvae can turn into a male in the male cells, it can turn into a female in the female cells, and a queen in the queen cells. So it's about creating the right environment for that, and on a stem cell level, yeah, exactly, absolutely. And stem cells is something we know, and we know that differential, and like the bees, we know that. But I'd go even one step farther in saying we can take raw, I want to say amino acids or peptides or whatever, just proteins, and build them into things. Or go right back to the elemental side and say we can take carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen and oxygen and make those raw elements into a living life form with this type of technology. Yeah,
Or go to
yeah.
a new planet and start a biological
And start from there.
quantify.
Well, you know, the cymatics.
Soil, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, cymatics, like, is everybody familiar with Hans Jenny, who used sound? So he would take plates that resonated at certain frequencies, so a triangular shaped plate or a square plate at a certain size, and he'd run a bow on this plate. You put sand on the plate and you run a bow on it, you see all the harmonic nodes that come into play on the plate. And you see the sand or lycopodium or whatever dance around, and it forms into geometric shapes. Well, I got that from when I saw that, and he had one plate that he resonated, and then he evolved from that and he started making transducers, so you had electronics making frequencies into this thing. And he's running through frequencies in there, and all of a sudden there was like a spinal column with like vertebrae in it, and it was exact spinal column coming in the vibration patterns of the thing. And then he tweaked it a little bit and it turned into like a worm, like a centipede thing with legs on it, and it had a head and a tail. And there was these like models of structure of living life things that are coming just from sound resonance and
It's like
and this.
Vedic philosophy.
Yeah.
Everything is just frozen. Everything in the universe is just frozen music.
Yeah, frozen music or light and
Just a quick
the vibration.
on your stem cells.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, definitely so. And the beauty of this, and I've done it, I haven't really talked about it, but what you can do is you can do your own sounds through here. So with a simple adapter, you can put a microphone on there and you can do your Qigong sounds and, you know, get an organ sounds and sit in there and then go shi and resonate yourself, and your body creates an internal feedback, a loop from the outside to the inside. That would be really awesome to do with that. Or you can record your sounds and then play them through there. But if you can do it live, that'd be a really thing, because you create a feedback loop. That'd be fun.
Biologically active field. So putting your biology and your sound into that field just would magnify it for you.
Yeah. What?
Tuning forks?
Yeah, tuning forks. Yeah. We've had one fellow who does healing with tuning forks, and he basically, you know, hit tuning forks and put them on different acupuncture points around your body, and very effective. He got a Quantaphi and then started working with the tuning forks and realized that he didn't need the tuning forks anymore. He just recorded all the tuning forks in the high-res audio file, and then he played the tuning forks through the Quantaphi, and then he just had to touch the people in the field where he needed the energy to go, which is kind of neat.
Acupuncturists using it as well.
Yeah,
Put the needles
yeah, and the needles are, anything metal becomes an antenna in this kind of field. So if you put in needles on acupuncture points, you're basically doing like a electro acupuncture wirelessly with the device as well.
How long do you have to stay with you just to get the entrainment, and how long does it last?
Yeah, the entrainment happens pretty darn quick. I would say within seconds your body trains to it, just like you can pick up the beat as fast as your body can pick up the beat in the music. And then last thing, as in your question at the back there, you know, how do you take it out for the day or whatever? I think if you got enough exposure during the day, if you were running at night, some people have them in their bedroom or whatever and run them at night, or you get so much per day. We haven't really said a particular time, but the nice thing about the Quantaphi is you can leave it on all the time. So people that have yoga studios and stuff like that will just, when they come in the morning, they turn it on and run it and go. But yeah, it's probably, I would say, you know, if you got a good half an hour in a day, it's probably pretty good. It's going to do you more good than not doing it. At least you getting your body out of that thing. The thing, like I said earlier, it's like even a single frequency is nice for the body at first. It resonates with and it has some healing effect, but then if it's listening to that same frequency all day long, then it's going to... So that's how you can vary this. So yeah, incremental amounts. It's probably Yeah, I'd say probably shorter dosages. It's the same thing with the Theraphi. That's why we leave the Theraphi, we don't leave it on continuously. We put it on and then off, on and off, switch it on and off. And then you're kind of covered. Yeah. All right.
I'm actually looking forward to watching the recording again.
Yeah.
Just to double up the
Well, that could be a 6-month course.
Well, you may want to stay around for